$50 doesn't buy much anymore, but in this town, it buys a front row seat to a man's humiliation. Trent Larson thought he was purchasing an easy knockout, a local farmer, a heavy bag with a pulse. He never noticed the farmer's eyes, calm, empty, like deep water over jagged rocks. Grease has a way of embedding itself into the whorls of your fingerprints so deeply that no amount of pumice soap can ever scrape it out. Clayton James stared at his hands under the harsh yellow light of the barn. Blackened knuckles. A jagged, poorly healed scar cutting across the back of his left thumb. He smelled burnt wiring and ancient diesel, the distinct metallic stench of a combine harvester giving up the ghost. The heat of the July evening pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Out in the fields, the cicadas screamed in a steady, deafening drone. Clayton dragged a rag over his hands, doing nothing but moving the grease around. The alternator was shot, sizzled into a useless lump of copper and iron. A replacement was $500. He had $83 in his checking account, a mortgage payment due on the first and 30 acres of winter wheat that wouldn't harvest itself. He didn't want to go to town. He wanted to sit on his porch, drink a cheap domestic beer, and let the quiet ringing in his ears, a parting gift from a mortar shell in Ramadi 12 years ago, lull him to sleep. But the wheat didn't care about his fatigue. 30 minutes later, Clayton's rusted Ford truck crunched onto the gravel lot of the Iron Horse Tavern. It wasn't a tavern. It was a corrugated steel pole barn sitting on the county line, reeking of stale cigarette smoke, spilled draft beer, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. On Friday nights, Russell Cobb cleared away the pool tables. Rusty, a man whose gut hung over his belt like a sack of wet laundry, ran an unsanctioned bare-knuckle adjacent fight club for the local farmhand. Off-duty deputies and anyone stupid enough to think they had a chin. Clayton walked through the heavy wooden doors. The air conditioning was broken, replaced by two massive industrial fans that just circulated the humid, swampy air. The noise hit him first, a chaotic wall of shouting glass clinking, and the heavy bass of the jukebox fighting against the roar of the crowd. He stood near the back, keeping his shoulders rolled forward, making his 6-foot frame look smaller. He wore faded Carhartt pants, stiff with dried mud, and a plain gray t-shirt stained with engine oil. He ordered a club soda from the bar. "You look like hell, Clayton." Rusty grunted, sliding the sweating glass across the sticky plywood counter. "Combine died," Clayton said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. He took a sip. The carbonation burned the back of his throat. "Need cash." Rusty let out a raspy laugh, wiping down the bar with a rag that looked dirtier than the counter. "You ain't gonna find no loans in here tonight, just bad decisions." He nodded toward the center of the room. "Though, if you're feeling suicidal, there's always the open challenge." Clayton followed Rusty's gaze. In the center of the makeshift ring, a 20 by 20 square of interlocking foam mats held together by duct tape, stood Trent Larson. Trent was 24, aggressively tanned, and smelled violently of aerosol body spray. He wore black board shorts and tightly wrapped hand tape. He was bouncing on his toes, throwing lightning-fast jabs at the empty air. A sharp snap-snap echoed as his punches broke the stagnant air. Trent ran a martial arts gym 2 towns over. He had 3 amateur MMA, belts, a tribal tattoo wrapping around his bicep, and the kind of loud, unearned confidence that made Clayton's stomach physically churn, not with fear, with a bone-deep exhaustion. 3 minutes, Trent shouted to the crowd, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. "Anyone lasts 3 minutes, you walk away with $500 cash. No gloves, submission or knockout." Trent wasn't fighting for the money. He was fighting for the dopamine hit of watching someone lesser fold under his hands. Clayton watched him throw a spinning hook kick. It was technically perfect, beautiful even. The crowd of mechanics and mill workers collectively oohed. Clayton stared at Trent's feet. They were clean, uncalloused. The feet of a man who fought on padded mats under bright fluorescent lights, with a referee standing by to make sure nobody actually died. $500, Clayton muttered, staring into his club soda. "Don't do it, James," Rusty warned, his tone dropping the jovial bartender act. That kid's broken 2 jaws this month. He's fast, and he likes hurting people. Clayton closed his eyes. The headache at the base of his skull throbbed. He hated violence. He had spent his 20s drowning in it. As a SEAL officer, he hadn't just committed violence, he had orchestrated it. He had sent boys younger than Trent into mud brick compounds where the air smelled of cordite and voided bowels. He had spent the last 8 years trying to scrub that cold, calculating part of his brain out with manual labor and silence. But the tractor needed an alternator. Clayton set the glass down. It made a dull, heavy thud on the wood. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tight, coiled muscles there. He didn't feel heroic. He felt deeply, profoundly tired. "Hold my drink, Rusty." The crowd parted with a low murmur of confusion as Clayton stepped off the sticky floor and approached the edge of the mats. He didn't vault over the makeshift rope barrier. He didn't puff out his chest. He awkwardly lifted one leg over the rope, then the other, looking like a man stepping over a low fence to check on a stray calf. Trent stopped his shadowboxing. He dropped his hands to his hips, a smirk cutting across his face. He looked Clayton up and down, the muddy boots, the oil-stained shirt, the slight stoop in his posture. "You lost, old man?" Trent asked. The crowd snickered. "I heard 500, Clayton said. His voice barely carried over the whir of the industrial fans. He didn't look Trent in the eye. He looked at the duct tape holding the blue mats together. It was peeling at the corners. "You got a death wish, farmer." Trent laughed, stepping closer. He invaded Clayton's personal space, trying to force eye contact. Up close, Trent smelled like spearmint gum and raw adrenaline. His pupils were blown wide. "I hit hard. I'm not going to go easy on you just because you got dirt on your jeans." Clayton slowly reached down and untied his work boots. He pulled them off, placing them neatly outside the ring. He peeled off his thick wool socks next. His bare feet stepped onto the mats. They were pale, scarred, with thick calluses built up from years of walking on uneven furrows. "Just ring the bell, Trent," Clayton said mildly. Rusty walked to the edge of the mat holding a thick wad of bills. He looked at Clayton with genuine pity. "All right, 3 minutes. You go limp, you tap, or you don't get up, it's over. No eye gouging, no biting." "Easy money," Trent announced to the room, raising his taped hands. He bounced from foot to foot, his breathing hissing through his teeth in sharp, rhythmic bursts. "Tss, tss, tss." Rusty chopped his hand down. Trent closed the distance instantly. He didn't respect Clayton, which meant he didn't bother with a feeler jab. He threw a heavy looping overhand right, aiming to end it in 3 seconds. Clayton didn't slip with the graceful fluidity of a boxer. He simply hunched his shoulders and tucked his chin, a brutal, pragmatic movement. Trent's fist crashed into Clayton's forehead, the thickest, hardest bone in the human skull. A sickening crack echoed. Trent winced, stumbling back a half step, shaking his right hand. He had aimed for the jaw and hit solid bone. Clayton felt a flash of white light behind his eyes. A dull, sickening wave of nausea rolled through his stomach. It hurt badly. He wasn't invincible. He was 38 years old. His knees ached from the damp and his lower back was a constant knot of pain. He tasted the sharp metallic tang of blood where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. "Stay small," a cold, dead voice whispered in his mind. The voice he hadn't heard since the dusty streets of Al-Anbar. Let him work. Watch his hips. Trent, angered by his own mistake, unleashed a flurry. A jab snapped Clayton's head back. A vicious low kick slammed into Clayton's left thigh. The sound of flesh on flesh, a wet, heavy thwack, made a woman in the front row gasp. Clayton stumbled, his leg buckling slightly. "Come on, dirt boy!" Trent spat, smelling blood. He threw a high roundhouse kick, aiming for Clayton's temple. Clayton's reaction was entirely devoid of grace. It was ugly, born of survival rather than sport. He didn't try to block the kick. He stepped into it. He lunged forward, closing the space before the leg could generate full momentum. Trent's shin slapped harmlessly against Clayton's ribs, wrapping around his back. With Trent balanced on one leg, his momentum compromised. Clayton just leaned his weight forward and shoved. It was a clumsy, heavy push. Trent crashed backward onto the foam mats, his breath leaving him in a loud oof. The crowd fell dead silent. The jukebox in the corner seemed to suddenly blare louder, a tinny country song mocking the tension. Trent scrambled to his feet, his face flushing crimson. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, furious grimace. He felt humiliated. A dirt-poor farmer had just dumped him on his back. Clayton stood exactly where he had been. He wiped a streak of blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his greasy thumb. He looked at the red smear on his skin. He felt the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his heart in his chest. He didn't want to be here. He hated the adrenaline flooding his veins. It felt like poison. "You're dead!" Trent hissed, shifting his stance. He dropped his hands slightly, preparing for a takedown. He was going to take the farmer to the ground, mount him, and cave his face in. Clayton sighed, a short, ragged breath that smelled of stale beer and copper. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the joints pop. He stopped trying to look small. He squared his hips. His stance shifted from the awkward slouch of a tired farmer to a grounded, perfectly balanced base. He didn't raise his fists like a boxer. He kept his hands low open, relaxed. Trent charged, feigning a left hook and shooting for Clayton's waist. He expected the farmer to sprawl or panic or stumble backward. Instead, Clayton stepped slightly to the diagonal. It was a micro-adjustment, barely an inch of movement, but it changed the angle of the entire fight. Trent was suddenly diving into empty air. As Trent's head dropped past Clayton's waist, Clayton didn't strike. He didn't need to. He simply placed his heavy, calloused hand on the back of Trent's neck, gripped the thick fabric of his board shorts with the other, and used Trent's own desperate momentum against him. With a sickening crash, Trent face-planted into the unyielding floor beneath the thin foam mat. Splinters of pain radiated up Clayton's arms from the sheer force of the redirection. Clayton stepped back his chest, heaving his left leg throbbing violently from the earlier kick. He looked down at the martial artist who was currently gasping for air, nose pressed into the duct tape. 2 minutes left, Clayton said quietly. Foam squeaked under Trent's palms as he pushed himself up from the mat. A thin, bright line of crimson leaked from his left nostril, tracking down his lip and dropping onto his bare chest. He wiped it away with the back of his taped hand, leaving a smeared red streak across his knuckles. He didn't look at the crowd anymore. The performance aspect of the fight had evaporated, replaced by a hot, ugly panic that he desperately tried to mask with rage. He had never been handled like that. He was used to guys who swung wild, guys who telegraphed their haymakers from the next zip code, guys who gassed out in 60 seconds. Clayton wasn't swinging. Clayton wasn't even breathing hard. He just stood there, his shoulders hunched, his bare feet gripping the peeling duct tape, watching Trent's hips with dull, tired eyes. "Lucky push!" Trent snarled, his voice tight. He stepped forward, abandoning the bouncy point karate stance. He adopted a tight Muay Thai guard hands, high elbows tucked, intending to walk the farmer down and chop his legs out from under him. Trent closed the distance with a hard, chopping low kick. This time, Clayton didn't step in. He lifted his lead leg, checking the kick perfectly. Bone cracked against bone. The sound was sharp, like a baseball bat striking a heavy wooden post. Trent hissed in pain, his shin instantly swelling, but he didn't stop. He planted his foot and threw a brutal elbow aimed at the bridge of Clayton's nose. Clayton slipped it by a fraction of an inch, the coarse fabric of Trent's hand wrap grazing his cheekbone. The proximity brought the violent stench of Trent's aerosol deodorant and fear sweat directly into Clayton's nostrils. It smelled sharp, metallic, acidic. It smelled like every terrified young man Clayton had ever dragged out of a compound in Fallujah. The memory flashed hot and bright, the crunch of glass under combat boots, the static crackle of a radio earpiece, the heavy, suffocating weight of ceramic plates against his chest. Clayton blinked, forcing the desert out of his eyes, dragging himself back to the humid, beer-soaked air of the Iron Horse Tavern. Trent capitalized on the microsecond of hesitation. He locked his hands behind Clayton's neck in a tight plum clinch, pulling the older man's head down. He drove his right knee upward, aiming for Clayton's ribs. The knee connected with a sickening thud. Clayton felt a rib crack. It wasn't a clean snap, but a deep grinding shift in his cartilage that instantly robbed him of his breath. A white-hot spike of agony shot through his left side. His vision swam. The crowd erupted. They smelled blood. Trent tried to throw a second knee. He never got the chance. The pain didn't make Clayton panic. It acted like a switch bypassing the weary farmer and tapping directly into a neural pathway forged over a decade of brutal, unrelenting close-quarters combat training. Clayton didn't try to break the clinch. He didn't try to wrestle Trent away. Instead, Clayton drove his thumbs directly into the soft, vulnerable notch at the base of Trent's throat right above the collarbone. He pressed inward and upward hard. Trent choked his gag reflex, firing violently. His hands instantly unclasped from Clayton's neck as his brain screamed at him to protect his airway. Freed from the clinch, Clayton didn't throw a punch. He grabbed the back of Trent's head with his left hand, tangling his thick, grease-stained fingers into the younger man's gelled hair. With his right forearm, he slammed a crossface into the side of Trent's jaw. It wasn't a boxing strike. It was a gross motor movement, ugly and mechanically devastating. The sheer torque twisted Trent's neck forcefully to the side, destroying his balance. Clayton simultaneously kicked Trent's supporting leg out of the calf. They crashed to the mat together. Trent scrambled frantically, trying to shrimp his hips out, trying to implement the Brazilian jiu-jitsu he taught at his gym. He tried to pull half guard. Clayton simply bypassed the guard entirely. He didn't play the sport. He dropped his entire body weight, 210 pounds of dense farm-hardened muscle, directly onto Trent's chest, achieving a mount so heavy it felt like a concrete slab had just been dropped from the ceiling. Trent gasped, his lungs instantly compressing. He tried to bench press the older man off him, a rookie mistake born of pure claustrophobic panic. Clayton easily swam his arms inside Trent's desperate push. He didn't rain down blows. He didn't try to smash Trent's face into the foam. He just flattened himself out, grinding his stubbled chin into Trent's eye socket, creating a horrific, abrasive friction. Clayton slid his left arm under Trent's neck, securing the back of the collar. He walked his right hand across the opposite side of Trent's throat, grabbing a handful of the heavy board-short fabric near the shoulder. It was an Ezekiel choke, modified for bare hands and street clothes. Clayton dropped his forehead to the mat next to Trent's ear and squeezed. He didn't yank. He didn't jerk. He applied the pressure with the slow, terrifying inevitability of an industrial vice. Trent's carotid arteries were pinched shut against his own windpipe. Underneath him, Trent thrashed like a netted shark. He bucked his hips, kicking his legs wildly into the air. His hands tore at Clayton's forearms, his manicured fingernails digging deep half-moons into Clayton's flesh, drawing tiny beads of blood. Clayton didn't even blink. He just held the pressure, his breathing slow, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled through his nose. 3 seconds, Clayton whispered into Trent's ear, his voice devoid of anger, malice, or triumph. It was a simple statement of biological fact. Trent's face turned a deep mottled purple. The thrashing became sluggish. The wild, wide-eyed panic in his eyes began to glaze over, replaced by the dark, encroaching tunnel of unconsciousness. At the edge of the mat, Rusty stood frozen, a wet rag dangling from his hand. The entire tavern was dead silent, save for the hum of the broken AC units and the frantic squeaking of Trent's bare heels against the mat. Before Trent's eyes rolled back completely, his right hand slapped the mat in a weak, frantic rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Clayton let go instantly. He didn't jump up and pound his chest. He didn't glare at the crowd. He slowly pushed himself off the younger man, rolling to the side and getting to his knees. His breath was coming slightly faster now, catching sharply on the broken rib. He pressed a hand against his left side, his face tightening into a grimace of pure exhaustion. Trent rolled onto his side, coughing violently. Huge, ragged gasps of air tore through his bruised throat. He curled into a fetal position, clutching his neck, humiliating tears of oxygen starvation pricking the corners of his eyes. He looked up at Clayton, expecting a taunt, a sneer, a kick. Clayton wasn't even looking at him. He was looking at his work boots sitting neatly at the edge of the mat. Clayton stood up. A severe limp dragged his left leg down as he walked over and picked up his socks. He sat on a nearby wooden stool, methodically pulling the thick wool over his pale feet, then sliding his boots on. He left the laces loose. Bending over hurt too much. The silence in the room was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and intensely uncomfortable. The men who had been screaming for blood a minute ago were now staring at the bottom of their beer bottles, suddenly very interested in peeling the labels. They had come to watch a flashy show. They had just watched a man get dismantled with terrifying, emotionless efficiency. It felt too real, too intimate. Rusty walked over his heavy boots thudding against the plywood floor. He extended a thick calloused hand holding 5 crumpled $100 bills. Clayton took the money. The paper felt damp with Rusty's sweat. He folded it neatly once and shoved it deep into the front pocket of his oil-stained Carhartts. Christ, James, Rusty muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Where the hell did you learn to move like that? Clayton looked at the bartender. The dull headache at the base of his skull was roaring back to life, fueled by the receding adrenaline crash. His hands were beginning to tremor slightly, a physiological reaction he hated more than anything else. He gripped the edge of the stool to hide the shaking. Just wanted to get back to my truck, Rusty, Clayton said quietly. He stood up, favoring his bruised ribs, and began the long walk to the door. As he passed the ring, Trent was finally sitting up, rubbing his throat, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and lingering shock. Trent caught Clayton's eye. He opened his mouth, perhaps to demand a rematch, perhaps to hurl an insult to salvage his shattered ego. Clayton stopped. He looked down at the martial artist. He noticed the slight tremble in Trent's jaw, the defensive posture of his shoulders. Keep your chin tucked when you throw that overhand. Clayton rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. And tape your wrists tighter. You're going to break a scaphoid hitting like that. Trent just stared, his mouth snapping shut. Clayton pushed through the heavy wooden doors and out into the suffocating July night. The oppressive heat felt almost welcoming after the icy tension inside the tavern. He walked across the gravel lot, the stones crunching loudly under his untied boots. He climbed into the cab of his Ford. It smelled like stale coffee dog hair and old dust. He inserted the key, twisting it. The starter whined in protest for a solid 5 seconds before the engine finally caught shuddering violently before settling into a rough, uneven idle. Clayton slumped against the worn cloth of the bench seat. He closed his eyes. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a profound, aching void. His ribs screamed with every intake of breath. His right hand was swelling where it had collided with Trent's jaw. His leg felt like it had been hit by a pipe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wad of cash. $500. He stared at it in the dim green glow of the dashboard lights. It wasn't a trophy. It was a transaction. He had traded pieces of his body and a fleeting ugly glimpse into his past for a piece of copper and iron. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the empty county highway. The headlights cut a weak yellow cone through the darkness. The cicadas were still screaming. The next morning, the sky was the color of bruised iron. A heavy summer storm was brewing, threatening to soak the fields before he could get the wheat cut. Clayton stood at the parts counter of O'Reilly Auto, sipping a styrofoam cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. He moved stiffly, every shift in weight sending a jolt of pain through his side. Got it right here, Clayton. Gary, the parts manager, said, hauling a heavy cardboard box onto the counter. Remanufactured alternator for the John Deere. That'll be $482 even. Gary looked up, noticing the dark purple bruise blooming across Clayton's cheekbone.